Welcome to this panel on climate interventions, where we'll be discussing the ethics, the governance, and the perceptions of climate interventions. I'm Julia Reindl. I'm a research fellow with DSG, the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. And I wanted to put a few words on why we're discussing this topic today. And I think I'm going to start by sharing Lorena's story. Lorena lives in the Philippines, and you will be sharing a little bit on this in a second as well. But the Philippines have been hit by 5 typhoons since October 24th, and you're really experiencing climate change on the ground. And we know COP is going on at the same time. The 1.5-degree target is moving out of sight. And with that has come increased attention around climate interventions in the media and in policy circles as well. And that brings us to the point that we're now. It's actually a quite special point because for these speculative technologies, there's virtually no governance at this present moment. So we really need discussion and a lot of brains on this topic to make sure we're moving into a direction that is equitable and just. And that's what we're going to try and do today. And I have a set of panelists here with intellectual firepower. And next to me is Lorena Sabino. She's with the University of the Philippines, and Lorena is researching the ethical and social implications of solar geoengineering. And she's also working with vulnerable communities, ridge-to-reef communities in the Philippines, and is trying to understand what the perceptions of these communities are when it comes to solar geoengineering. Then we have Matthias Honegger. Matthias is Director of Climate Interventions for ICFG, the International Center for Future Generations. I always stumble over this. And Matthias is working with policymakers to advance governance on solar geoengineering in Europe and the world. And then we have Dr. Renzo Taddei. Renzo is an anthropologist with the University of Sao Paulo, and he has been working intensively with indigenous communities and trying to understand how different groups of people understand interventions in nature and what that means. And I think to bring us all up to speed when it comes to climate interventions, because it's a very complex topic and many people probably in this room understand different things when we talk about climate interventions and maybe also don't know what it means. So Matthias, would you bring us up to speed and tell us a little bit what are the different techniques and what do they mean?
Yes, very gladly, and indeed it is encouraging to have this discussion, this conversation with an increasingly broad and wide and also a very creative community. Right now this is really an academic discussion so far, and I think we need to change that. We need to make this a conversation that's inclusive, global, and really bringing in the diverse experiences and knowledges that we have around the world. So what you're seeing here on this picture is a satellite image of the ocean. Most of our planet is ocean. And so you can see that's a pretty dark surface. You can also see that there's a lot of white. Those are clouds, obviously. And so what those clouds do is they reflect sunlight, which would otherwise reach the ocean's surface. And because the ocean is so dark, it would absorb more heat. But those clouds, they reflect that energy, and therefore they provide a sunshade for the ocean, for the planet as such. And the idea, that's really at the core of the idea of sunlight reflection methods, or SRM, as it's called in academic discussion, is to have that reflectivity enhanced by human measures, deliberate measures in the atmosphere to cool, which counteracts the warming trend that we have. There are different ways in which one could do this. One is to actually create clouds over the oceans, literally. Another one is to, and this is very much hypothetical, very much an idea still, to have something between the Earth and the sun, a sunshade in space. And the third one, which is the most often discussed in academia, is the idea of having a sunshade not made of textile, but of aerosols, of tiny droplets of a certain substance, which isn't clear yet what that might be, at a high altitude in the atmosphere, basically twice the level that airplanes normally fly. So this parasol, what do we know about it? The science says, well, basically based on climate models, computer simulations, it's pretty clear that it would have this cooling effect, and along with it, it would have several benefits as well in countering climate change if it was done wisely. Yet, we really don't know nearly enough about the side effects and the potential risks of these interventions, because clearly this is interfering in a very complex system. So I'd like us to approach this with a mixed sense of awe, curiosity, perhaps a bit of hope, but also a very great deal of respect. I think it is clear in the climate community, it's not something that's easily talked about. It's only emerging. I'm just coming from Baku, from the climate conference there. 9 years after the Paris Agreement was adopted, they're still talking about the same questions there, and they're gradually hearing this as well and starting to figure out what might this mean. Yeah, I'll hand back on this.
Great. You just mentioned already risks and implications. One question that I have would be, could you describe what a world with and without geoengineering could look like? And maybe I'll just give that question over to you, because I just mentioned the experience you had in the last weeks. Could you maybe start from that point, and then we go from there, what that could mean if we would have geoengineering? Yeah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the question is with and without geoengineering. Without geoengineering, in my perspective, it's just like we are depending on the effectiveness of adaptation and emission reduction methods. But of course, we have to consider the temperature control. Like for example, with geoengineering, there's an immediate cooling of the planet, but of course we are not solving the issues on the root causes of the problem, particularly the greenhouse gases. And then the second one is the societal impacts. We have to consider that because with geoengineering, maybe less disasters. From my experience, before going here, there was a super typhoon in the Philippines, and then I thought that my flights will be canceled because some of the international flights are already canceled. And from my experience, last October 2024, our house was flooded, and that was my first time. In our house, it was our second time to experience flooding event, and in my hips, the water level. And of course, destruction of our properties, our car. Until now, our car is in the casa for repair. And of course, with geoengineering, I am thinking of maybe the planet will be cooler and less disasters. And of course, we have to consider the possible dependence on this artificial intervention. Those are if there's geoengineering. But without geoengineering, we should push through or strong collaboration for sustainable practices, effective adaptation measures. But in the case of the Philippines, land use change is another issue. There's no areas to plant more trees or do reforestation because land areas are being converted to other uses. So that's another concern, and making the communities more vulnerable. So in the Philippines, name it, we have it, storm surge, sea level rise, flooding, drought, and those climate hazards are affecting the vulnerable communities. So, I think.
Maybe back to you, Matthias. Are there any other social and ethical implications that are a bit broader that we could share?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue on all of this is the uncertainty that we face. We have this vague idea that it might work, that doing this planetary sunshade would actually reduce all these risks, typhoon, hurricanes, floods, droughts, wildfires. But at the same time, if it turns out that it's true, that it might work, it would still have potentially uneven effects around the world. And some climate impacts would still happen. And so then the question is, well, if someone did it, naturally another country might experience a problem down the road. Whether that's caused or not by this intervention, they might end up blaming the action of intervening in the climate system. And that blaming would, of course, really risk serious tensions on the international stage. So approaching this requires us to come together at the global stage to really think through what happens, how do we come to an agreement, and how do we make sure that those conflicts don't erupt. Naturally, with climate change, conflicts are also prone to come up because those changes are grave and include things like entire Earth systems, like entire ocean circulations slowing down or even stopping. And that would disrupt our climate zones and therefore cause migration. And we know that this is difficult to manage. So therefore, there are risks on both sides. And the biggest issue right now is the uncertainty around it.
Yeah, talking about governance, can you share a little bit on what governance systems we have for this right now? I guess it's a very short answer, because there's not much.
There is a short answer and there's a longer one as well. But yes, I think the short answer you're alluding to is, in fact, there is no dedicated governance venue to discuss this. I have been working with people who have been going around the world to world leaders, bringing this issue to them, saying, you need to think this through. You need to understand what the implications would be for you, for your country, and to figure out where we can have these conversations at the international stage. So the UN naturally has an important role, but where exactly in the UN system is not quite so clear yet. There are some emerging attempts to have discussions, to share information on the UN Environment Assembly, Environment Program in Nairobi. There are other venues where this is coming up in terms of scientific assessments as well. The World Climate Research Program has a lighthouse initiative to convene the researchers, to have that science engagement, which has to be, in my view, the foundation for diplomatic engagements. But those are really only the starting points.
Yeah, I would also love to give the word to Renzo. What is your perspective on this, and what do you think needs to happen to create just and equitable governance systems that do not perpetuate certain global power dynamics that we're seeing now?
Yeah, well, thank you, and good afternoon. Now, indeed, well, those of you who are following the debate know that this is a really contentious issue, right? There are very strong resistance from part of the academia, but also particularly among environmentalists and ecologists and so on, due to the ecological risks involved. And so I would like, before addressing the issue of governance, I would like to just mention why, right? To add more detail of why some people are so resistant to the idea. So one of the things is that when we think about changing the chemical composition of the stratosphere, because that's what we're talking about, right? So changing, well, first of all, it's important to understand that we have been doing this. It's not that we are, if we deploy geoengineering, we'll start changing the chemistry of the atmosphere. No, we have been doing this for many, many decades, eventually many centuries already, right? But the thing is, when we think about disturbing the chemistry of the atmosphere as it is being proposed, the first thing we have to remember is that when we change solar radiation, we are going to affect photosynthesis in the entire planet. So there are unknown risks, but there are known risks. One of the known risks is disturbing weather patterns like rainy seasons in particular parts of the globe, right? So, and then one of the governance, the most important governance issues is related to how to address possible negative impacts, such as something like a disturbance in the monsoon systems in South Asia due to an eventual deployment of solar geoengineering. So we may have, so right now we have 700 million individuals on this planet in extreme poverty and facing some form of hunger. So, and the most of it is in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. Right? So deploying something like geoengineering may affect rains that are important for subsistence agriculture. So we're talking about the possibility of causing hunger in the scale of hundreds of millions of people very fastly, right? So there are no governance infrastructures on the planet that can move resources to address a challenge of that size. National countries don't have, clearly we see that, national countries don't have the infrastructures necessary for providing security to the populations. So clearly this scares away so many people, right? And then we do have a conversation going on, still in initial stages, but going on for some time at the UN multilateral meetings and other instances. But what we clearly see is that none of what has been proposed so far is binding in any way. And this is, why is this a problem? One thing that is part of geoengineering is the fact that it does not address the cause root of the problem. It does not reduce carbon, and it may, one of the dangers of geoengineering is what has been called like the moral hazard of reducing the incentive for nations and corporations to reduce emissions. I mean, if you reduce the impacts of warming through geoengineering artificially, it may reduce the incentives for doing the hard effort of reducing carbon, right? So, so the thing is that so there's no not only we don't have any example, any clear example of collaboration at the international level that would address what we're talking about here, because without the dramatic reduction in carbon in the atmosphere, once geoengineering starts to be deployed, it needs to continue being deployed for centuries, right? And so what I'm talking about here is a governance mechanism and infrastructure that simply cannot fail, because the failure of doing it means that heat returns stronger than before and very fastly, right? So this is what is called termination shock. It's very dangerous. So one of the challenges of for the governance is that we just have to, we look at COP29 and we look at how things unfold. I mean, clearly there is an issue between the trust between Global North and Global South, right? So the Global South doesn't trust the Global North to deliver the funds that are required, and the Global North doesn't trust the Global South to use it wisely. So see, we don't have not even the trust that is required for putting in place a governance system that cannot fail. So this is why I am so happy to see a debate like this in this forum, because we need novelty. We need new forms of governance. We need new ideas. And just to finish my part, it's not the reason I'm saying this is that the way I see geoengineering, of course, I mean, it's a dangerous, risky, and scary idea, but I don't think we are in a position to say, no, we don't want it. Because if we step back and look at the larger context, we see that this is a direction that technological development took many, many decades ago, centuries ago. So technology development is heading towards giving societies the power to intervene in the Earth systems as never before. We are heading towards a moment in which we will be able to choose whether we want to allow an earthquake to take place or not, or whether we will have technology to kill hurricanes when they are still in the early stages. So the point is it wise to do it? Should we do it? We don't have answers. We never had to address this issue as a species or as societies. But we will very quickly get to the point with quantum computing and other technological innovations in which these will be the decisions we'll have to make. So solar geoengineering is just a wake-up call. So it is a conversation we cannot avoid. And it's very important that we generate new ideas and new mechanisms.
Yeah, now you've been talking about geoengineering as a whole, but I think one step comes before deployment, and we don't know if that's ever going to happen. But now we're still talking about governance over research. And I wanted to ask you, Matthias, if you can share why it's so important to have transparent and national funded research governance and research. Yeah.
Yeah, I heard a very important keyword from Renzo earlier. I think that was trust. And I think trust is the precondition for governance at the end of a process that is going from early stage research, from early questions, how would this look like? How would we go about it? Would it work? How does the climate respond? All these questions obviously need answers. And the way in which we approach them matters a great deal. So I think there is a great opportunity, in fact, in conducting research in a way that builds this trust. If it is done transparently, with public funding, in an accountable way, that also publics, civil society organizations, and also different types of researchers, critical researchers from different angles, get to poke holes into the ways in which the research is being done, to ask, well, but did you consider this? Did you consider that? I think those critical questions make the research stronger, and I think that's where we can start right now, is to set up the research endeavor, which is currently really lacking, in such a way that this is possible, that this is done, that it's also done not just at the national level, but on the international level, where different questions get asked. How does this affect my region? In my region, this particular climate aspect matters a great deal, perhaps even for cultural reasons. So that these questions bubble up, both nationally, regionally, and then at the global stage, and they inform the process. It becomes this evolving ecosystem of research activities that really builds the basis, I think, for the future decisions that need to be taken then.
Yeah, may I add?
Yes,
yeah.
please.
Yeah. So in terms of governance, I think we have to consider public engagement is very important. Particularly the vulnerable sector should be part in the process of decision making. And at the same time, governance should be in place before deployment. And of course, we have to consider the future generation, the intergenerational impacts of the future generation, because let's say geoengineering will be deployed by 20 years, 30 years from now. Who will get affected? It's the future generation. They should be part in the process of discussion, forum, and decision making.
Yeah, I think one thing that we've just touched upon is trust. And we live in a time right now where there's a lot of mistrust and misinformation. Conspiracy theories are sort of enmeshed easily with ideas on geoengineering. I think this is a very speculative science fiction sort of sounding set of ideas. And we see in the US, for instance, that this July there was a bill passed where the release of airborne chemicals has been banned, and that was based on conspiracy theories around chemtrails. So yeah, I would generally be interested in hearing what are perceptions around the world when it comes to solar geoengineering. How do publics think about this set of techniques? What are the hopes? What are the fears?
Yeah, currently there's still limited studies on the perception, but I read from the Siguriyama in this year, 2024, their study on the attitude in terms of the technology in Asia Pacific countries. Like for example, in the Philippines and India, who are currently experiencing climate change impacts, they are more inclined, or they have hope for this technology to solve the problem. But in areas like Japan and Australia, they are not that okay with the technology. So in my understanding, those vulnerable countries or developing countries are more positive for that deployment, except for the developed countries, because they have the reason there, the developing countries, their adaptive capacity is very low in terms of financial aspects, in terms of many aspects, socioeconomic aspects. So that's very challenging. And of course, part of the concern is the accountability, the unintended risk with this kind of technology, societal risk or environmental risk, and even the cultural norms will get affected, particularly in indigenous communities that they commune with nature. If this technology will be deployed, everything will be changed also, as mentioned by Renzo.
Yeah, I think on this note, Renzo, do you want to share a little bit on, since you have worked with indigenous communities in Brazil and have explored what it means to intervene in nature for those peoples versus in the Western world where this vision also emerged from?
Yes, well, this is an interesting and complex, difficult conversation. I think the criticism coming from the indigenous knowledge of all elders and leaders is useful for us to put the Western ideas about not only geoengineering but also nature and how we organize society in context, right? So, first of all, it's important to mention that well, my source is the work of some Amazonian indigenous authors, mainly Davi Kopenawa, which is a shaman and political leader from the Yanomami people in northern Brazil. But his ideas tend to resonate with other leaders across the Americas. So the point is that nature is something else in the traditional philosophies of indigenous individuals, right? In something else in what sense? I mean, very often what we hear when we listen to the elders or when we read what they write is the idea that there is no nature that is empty of some form of agency or intentionality, which is the typical view of the West, right? So nature is basically natural resources, or they provide some form of ecosystem service, but they are not something with which we have to engage in ways that we would see as political. So there's no agency we have to address or negotiate with. But that's exactly the point of the traditional modes of life of indigenous peoples. So everything that is important has some form of agency and intentionality, which means that indigenous leaders don't simply use nature. So this kind of nature that is used does not exist. So if everything that matters has some form of agency and intentionality, all relations become political. So engaging with a river becomes a political issue. You have to do it very carefully, or with other animals. And of course, most people, indigenous peoples across the Americas, they are not vegetarians. I mean, they do hunt and eat. So these has to be done in very careful and negotiated ways. So when you have that perception of nature, in which nature, as we think about it, simply doesn't exist, so life becomes more complicated. But one net result of it is the protection of biodiversity. So indigenous peoples, which according to the UN are 6% of the planet, but they control in one form or another 80% of the biodiversity. The reason they do it is not because they are concerned about biodiversity, it's because the traditional modes of life produce the protection of biodiversity even when they're doing something else, just going along with their everyday lives, because of this architecture of knowledge and how they understand reality. So that's why there is a deep resistance to the commodification of land and water, and therefore to the commodification of the air. So when we think about carbon credits, most indigenous leaders see that as the new colonial frontier. The air becomes the new colonial frontier. So very often what they say is the Western societies are dysfunctional, but very often the Western scientists come up with dysfunctional tools. So for them, changing the chemistry of the atmosphere is not the appropriate way of addressing this, but it will be simply changing the entire paradigm and starting understanding the sacredness of things. So see, this debate is difficult when we get indigenous leaders. But of course, I mean, there are indigenous individuals doing all sorts of things in all forms of activity. So that's why I'm referring to traditional modes of life, because you do have indigenous individuals that may, in surveys, for instance, demonstrate the support for this kind of technology.
Lorena, do you want to add some of your research, your knowledge on this perspective as well?
Yeah. Unfortunately, our study just started just September, and then we are about to go to the field last October, and because of that series of typhoon events that hit in the Philippines, our research activities were also canceled. So, but in our team, in terms of their perception, I asked them, can you rate your idea, your knowledge in terms of the climate intervention? The range is 1 to 5. 5 is the highest in terms of knowledge and perception and the technology. So most of my team, they gave a score of 2. So it means we need to do more research, that everyone should be educated, should be empowered about this technology. Of course, there are the good, and of course, there are the bad side. But we have to explore. I think we need to study trade-off analysis, the positive and then the negative. Which one is bigger benefits? And in addition, the young people, they are not so familiar with these emerging technologies. So we have to empower them also, we have to capacitate them also, because they are the future. And we are responsible, we are accountable to their lives. So maybe our little babies, they want to have a beautiful environment. If this technology outweigh the benefits, then what the future holds to them.
Right, and I think one aspect you just mentioned is also knowledge around this technology. So I actually would be interested in this room, who has heard of solar geoengineering before stepping in this room? Okay, I would say that's approximately maybe half of the people, and I think the audience here is quite educated when it comes to future-facing technologies. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily representative, but if we would walk somewhere outside, that's probably not the number that we would get. So I think one thing that's really, really important is also public engagement when it comes to this topic. Do you want to put some more words on this?
Perhaps just riffing on the issue of the future here, because I think you alluded to it. It's going to be future decision makers who have to grapple with this. Perhaps some of us will be part of that, but really, right now, we are not to take that decision. And so what we do today really shapes the basis on which they can do that. And sharing information in as widely as possible to empower different societal actors to be a part of that conversation, I think is one of the first things indeed to do. I think it's morally wrong to claim that we know enough and that we should shut this down as a conversation. I hear that from some folks who are so concerned about this that they'd rather it not be addressed at all. And I think that's wrong, because it may lead us to a point where some actors may choose differently. Some actors may say, I think there's merit in doing this, and therefore they might just try. And in that case, they would try in a much worse situation. They would basically not know what most of the planet population would think about this. And so the risks in that are really severe. Of course, it matters a great deal how we do this. And I think that's something for us to figure out continually, how to do this responsibly, both on research, but then also on communicating around it. No simple answer, I think, but yeah, we need to figure it out.
I think I have time for one last question for all of you. Oh, yeah, and then we get to your questions as well, directly after. But when we talk about this topic, we often talk about the governance and everything that happens before deployment. But not so much about what happens if this would actually be lived experience. And of course, we don't have large-scale research yet, or actually no research at all, and many of these techniques. So there's a lot of unknowns. But if you were to suspend your disbelief and think about 2044, stratospheric aerosol injection is being deployed, and you live in that world, wherever you're situated in these different parts of the world. What would be one thing that you think would change in your everyday life?
I was sort of hoping to go last, but I think I almost hope that nothing would change. I think that would be the ideal case. At the same time, I know, like in one of the previous panels, we saw this image of the Earth as a technosphere. Like virtually all parts of our planet are now in some ways touched by our activities. And so therefore, this would represent one step further, or perhaps several ones. And it would change probably how I feel as part of this life on this planet, just on a very fundamental level, like knowing that we are doing this for better or worse, hopefully for better. It changes the meaning of our existence here.
What about you, Renzo?
Renzo.
You can decide who wants to go first.
Okay, so there's a good scenario and a bad scenario, and so it's impossible to give just a straightforward answer. So the good scenario would be, and I live in South America, right? So good scenario would be that a lot of research. One thing about research, let me just quick mention this. Very often when we say we need more research, we think about more research in the natural sciences. I think we need 99% more research in the social sciences than in the natural sciences. I mean, of course, there are some issues to be solved in terms of the chemistry if it is ever to be deployed. But the challenge in understanding how we make decisions and how we organize ourselves politically are much more dramatic. So in 2044, I hope a lot of research, and this is a good scenario, would have been done on that, and we live in a new political and economic environment with very different frameworks in a totally decarbonized economy. I understand that 20 years may be not enough for that. But that is the bad scenario. The bad scenario is living with new forms of intense fear and anxiety.
Okay,
You go last.
mine. By that time, I am senior citizen. Okay, so my hope was will be on, because I came from the academe. There in the Philippines, if there is a typhoon, if there is intense heat, classes are suspended because we cannot cope. We don't have enough facilities like air condition for the intense heat, and for the typhoon events, our internet connectivity it's not that good. So my hope is by 2044 there will be no class suspensions. That's really impacting our lives always. Sad truth in the Philippines. During typhoons, the government should issue or give announcement, classes are suspended. And even during summertime, classes are suspended. And then the sad truth also, just this October, I forget the exact number, but more than 80 persons died because of the landslide events, because of that extreme heavy rainfall that hit in the Philippines due to typhoon weather events. So imagine just these 2 months, we have strong typhoons 5 times. Okay, 5 times. So I mentioned earlier, before coming here, that struggle to attend this forum is very crucial on my part because I have to leave my family with the typhoon events, and of course I have to think of my commitment to this forum. So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for coming and making this possible that you're here and that you speak. That's really important, I think. And now to the questions back there.
I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I think this kind of conversation, should be a main conversation within a forum like this, because this is the detrimental issues for the future of humanity, and we need to give it a priority. Now, looking at this and thinking about, I'm coming from a future perspective as the head of Center for Future Studies at the University of Dubai here. Are we really tackling the climate problem in a way that we should tackle it? Because I feel that we focus on point solutions. We focus maybe on carbon reduction. Okay, carbon reduction is one thing. We ran actually a panel during COP28 last year here in Dubai. And the panel was about the use of systems thinking to tackle such wicked problems, what we call them, as a climate problem. From our panelists here, Dr. Renzo, guys, are seeing really we giving a lot of effort in terms of how to probably leverage systems thinking to, try to tackle climate problem? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would agree with the observation that there's a lot of effort that has been going into a very specific set of solutions. And I think the fact that it's so difficult to have this conversation on climate interventions is a result of this in some sense. That said, even if it turns out that some of these interventions do work, even in a perfect scenario, we would still need to transition to clean energy sources, and quite rapidly so, because that's what Renzo also pointed out, is if we keep accumulating emissions, of course, there is a serious risk that if, for some reason, political or otherwise, this is stopped, then temperatures really rapidly jump. So that's the backdrop there. I do think systems thinking and perhaps also early warning systems, for example, could be an immense support for vulnerable people around the planet, independent of what else we do, because the climate risks are already here. And I think there's a lot more indeed to be done. Yeah.
Perhaps you can collect some of the questions.
Let's just see how much time we have left. I think we have like 5 minutes. Okay, let's just start
I'll
here.
keep it short.
Yeah, let's collect some of the questions and then maybe you can answer them.
My question is for Renzo regarding carbon markets. So could you tell us more about the perspectives of indigenous leaders and what their real concerns are and why they see it as these new forms of markets as neo-colonialism? And is there a saving grace that, maybe can keep our hope that these markets can have some sort of a positive impact, because they are emerging all over the GCC region now. Each Gulf country is establishing one or more of these markets today.
Let's collect some more questions.
So when you spoke about everyday life, a probably a stupid question popped to my head. It's like, will I still see the sun every day, or how often? That is the first one. And then I also thought, I'd be interested to know who are the main drivers politically right now to research this field, and are they the same governance or like organizations that are also affected by the problem of climate change, like in the future?
Maybe one last one and then we do another one.
We've talked a lot about the failure of our global decision-making systems for putting in place climate mitigations to date. So do we actually think that the deployment of solar geoengineering is really going to be done at an intergovernmental level where we've developed a fail-safe system of trust? Or is this actually going to be deployed by the private sector, as with generative AI, with no consultation at all?
I know there's some more. Let's take this round. And Renzo, maybe you can answer the first one. And then Matthias or Lorena.
Okay. So about the carbon markets, there's no way I have time to address this here, but let me suggest anyone interested. Let me see where I wrote my notes here. There are some indigenous organizations that address the problem. So one of them is called Indigenous Climate Action. So they have a website with many publications where they develop the issue of why carbon markets is not a solution. And then there's another organization that is not indigenous-led, but it's an important ally. It's the IWGIA, International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs. But what I think is that we are probably not going to have one solution that will work for everyone and everywhere. We'll probably have many different solutions, and carbon markets will probably be effective in some places at some times. But then there is the everlasting tendency of the West to believe that there's nothing beyond the West, and then the Western solutions are the only ones and the only effective and possible ones, and that is a real problem. And let me just say the last question. The reason I do think that we need to discuss this a lot is not only because new ideas and new government schemes need to be created, but also the risk of rogue actors, of free drivers, is enormous. And with the last election results in the US, it is even higher now. So it is urgent that these things are addressed.
Matthias, maybe on the sun.
Yes, will we still see the sun? Yes, we will. That's the simple answer. So the experience we have with large volcano eruptions doesn't exactly translate to this, even though it's usually used as the example we have from natural analogs. I just learned this a few days ago. There's a study that literally checked, basically, would you even notice a difference? And with very few exceptions, really specialized people who are super attuned to seeing minute differences in color, normal people, like probably all of us in this room, wouldn't even see a difference if you had the two skies side by side. So actually, it's an invisible sunshade, if you will. And of course, at the end of the day, it matters how it is done. But that's apparently for strategic as well injection that can be possible. I think on the governance, really, like there's a long history of environmental governance. Some actually super successful, like the Montreal Protocol. It works, and it's really interesting how these problems have a different varying structure where for some reason there's agreement on some issues, and on others there's really there may be agreement on the surface level, but the interests aren't really aligned. And I think that's the crux question, which I don't think we have studied yet exactly. How are those interests going to shape up? And I think, again, governments haven't started to figure that out for themselves, like what would they want to see. So that's the kind of work I would also like to see us doing in academia, but also with geopolitical experts and with governance practitioners or policy practitioners to understand that.
Just again, checking how much time we have. Maybe one more question. Okay, just right there.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a quick question. It kind of goes to the governance point as well. There's been some articles about geoengineering that have been coming out, and a lot of them are to the idea of move fast and break things, and the impacts of these entrepreneurs, if you will. They understand, but they also recognize that the research isn't there, and they admit that. There have been articles of a few saying that they cannot wait for the research, that we need to move now. And the impacts of some of these interventions, at least the ones I've read, are on communities with less capacities to deal with them. And I just want to hear about, and link it to a conversation that happened in this room yesterday actually, about the rights of nature. And I would love to hear about, yes, governance systems in the governments that already exist, but how can we improve upon, let's say, a coda of rights or even laws to protect nature or advocate for nature with its agency, maybe bringing in those perspectives into maybe governance models that already exist, or if we can imagine perhaps a new form of governance. Any quick reactions would be really helpful. Thank you.
Well, okay, I can start. This is a complex question, right? Because, I mean, if we accept the idea of the Anthropocene, even in a non-indigenous mode of thinking, nature is something else that is not somewhere else, right? So, but then if we think about the atmosphere, there is a biome in the atmosphere, right? So, I mean, if we think about the atmosphere as an ecosystem, and if we attribute rights to the ecosystem, of course, it puts in question the kinds of interventions we think about making. And I do think this is really an important aspect that needs to be in the discussion.
Yeah, the only sort of a linked issue I think that for me I can say is that, there's this notion of precaution. There's a governance principle called the precautionary principle, which means that in case of uncertainty, one should not hold back from taking action, but it doesn't really say what action. And of course, the object that is to be protected in this case may in fact be nature or the environment or however we want to refer to that. At the same time, there is also people to be protected, human health, etc. So there's really not an easy answer, I think, but it's indeed really a question we should ask, not just mechanistically, what can we do, but should we? And if so, what are the considerations? Yeah.
Okay, I know that we are supposed to leave this room as fast as possible, but thank you everyone to your questions and to the panelists. Yeah.
Thank you.